have fled Ukraine since the Russian invasion began on February 24th. More than half of those refugees have arrived in neighboring Poland. The UN Refugee Agency has warned this number may reach 4 million in the coming days. To talk to us about the gravity of the humanitarian situation in Ukraine and the geopolitics around that conflict are none other than Igor Garcia, who is the communications advisor at the MSF Emergency Unit, together with Brian Mutier, who is a lawyer, governance, peace and security expert. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for making time to join us here on Africa Speaks. Maybe I'll start with you, Igor. Your reaction, first reaction to what is going on in Ukraine.
Well, thank you for having us, Ashley. It's a terrible situation. We are leading towards a humanitarian catastrophe. In just 2 weeks, we see how the war is affecting a country that is slightly smaller in population than Kenya, more than 40 million people. There is violence, attacks, bombings, and artillery fire in many places in the country, particularly in the east and the central parts. It's a country that has been already suffering 8 years of conflict, particularly in the eastern side. So we have a population that is desperate, that is lacking food, that is lacking healthcare, that is lacking water. People are taking snow to drink, to get water. And we see also how the hospitals are increasingly affected, so we are trying to mobilize teams and supplies in order to get the basics. This is also right now one of the largest exoduses in the last decades, more than 2 million at this time, but the figure is increasing by hours. I have already crossed to neighboring countries, mainly to Poland, but to all the neighboring countries. And of course, we are expecting much more as the hostilities continue.
Yeah, Brian, years of conflict, and now the numbers could go to 4 million in the coming days. Like, this is not something small. It's something that people should be worried about. First reaction to it?
Yeah. It's unfortunate, first of all, actually, that the war has not gone within the realms and the principles that govern wars everywhere, because there are those guiding principles, of course, and the international human rights law that are supposed to be followed and adhered to in terms of the provided laws and the legal frameworks within the bigger customary law internationally. And I'm saying this because when you look at some of the casualties that have been, witnessed and reported, of course, some of these one border between the places such as places of worship, hospitals, schools, and also sources of food and water, and electricity, of course, which are very key and are protected under international human rights law in terms of the guiding principles and how wars are supposed to be conducted. It's unfortunate that Russia has not been able to observe such kind of provisions, and that has led to the kind of exodus of these civilians who are actually looking for safe havens and safe passage to countries such as Poland, where they are seeking some sort of security. So to me, I think it is important for Russia to understand that internationally recognized customs and practices of war must be adhered at all times, so that the civilians within both sides are actually protected.
All right. Coming to you, Igor. Ukraine said that the humanitarian corridors that are put in place are immoral because most of them lead to Russia and Belarus. Talk to us about that, especially from the humanitarian aspect of it.
Of course, we have currently the war affecting several cities which are currently in a siege situation, with the population trapped there. Humanitarian corridors, ceasefires are possibilities within a war frame as a last resort, but we need to remind here that the protection of civilians need to happen anytime, wherever the civilians are located, even if they decide to stay behind, because some people might not be in a position to leave, or whether these corridors are leading to Russia to a different destination is not on MSF to comment. But what is important is that people are free to choose where they want to live, where they want to go, and that their protection is ensured by the parties to the conflict. This is the key cornerstone thing. Okay,
and I like what you say. People are free to choose where they want to go. Yet here, you're being given 6 options, and most of them either lead to Russia or Belarus.
Or Poland.
Yeah, or Poland,
Yeah. I think within that context, he has actually explained it's very important for us to say that people are saying that, of course, it is a good opportunity for civilians from Ukraine to be given that opportunity to cross over to whichever country. But again, we are saying that they are being displaced because they are leaving their country of comfort. They are living their social, life and being forced or being told to choose where to go, which is perhaps a two-edged sort of analysis that we need to look into, whether first of all it is right to displace people who are affected by this war, or you can create that safe haven for them, that you are not going to touch the places that they are settling, you are not going to hit the sources of their livelihood, you are not going to hit their settlements and so on and so on, medical facilities, schools and so on and so on. So it is an issue of whether it is right for Russia to be able, or combatants to be able to, destabilize their settlements within Ukraine itself. By the time we are talking about giving them safe passages to countries such as Belarus or Poland, first of all, we have to address the conduct of combatants. And of course, given an opportunity, of course, we can talk about the conduct of combatants within or during times when war is actually happening, and also conduct of combatants before and also after the war is actually happening.
All right, but Brian, is it really a safe haven, considering what we've been hearing the Ukrainian president say that, on Monday actually he accused the Russian army of impeding the evacuation of civilians. So is it really safe?
It is not safe, because one of the principles that guides war is, first of all, you select and then you use the highest point of precision when you are hitting your aim. And that's one of the principles that governs the convention, Geneva Convention on Wars, that by the time you aim at whatever part you want to aim, you have to carry it with the highest point of precision. In the event that you do not do that, then you affect settlements which are not part of combatants. People, where people are living, where children are, where women are, those are places which are protected by the international human rights law in terms of conduct of war. So, from where I'm seated, of course they can do better than that. Carry out better precision, avoid settlements, avoid places which are protected by international human rights law in terms of their sources of livelihood.
Okay, Igor, maybe you can tell us what exactly MSF is doing on the ground right now, because you're more privy to that situation and whatever is going on.
Yeah, Doctors Without Borders, MSF, has been present in Ukraine over the last 8 years of conflict, and since the war started 2 weeks ago, we are trying to readapt our operations to an emergency mode. This foremost important thing at this moment is to try to bring medical supplies in, like trauma kits, surgical kits, because as we are seeing already, several places in the country are being affected by heavy fighting, and hospitals are becoming overwhelmed. We heard reports of a lot of war wounded, and also even some of the health facilities have been hit. So we have been sending huge cargoes of medical supplies over the last days. We are continuing to do so. Some of them have arrived to the capital, Kyiv, to eastern parts of the country. And at the same time, we are trying to see, in this very volatile context, what will be possible for us in order to become hands-on, operational, in order to support as much as possible the health system in Ukraine. Also, because of this very high influx of refugees that we are seeing, we have sent emergency teams to most of the countries that are neighboring Ukraine, and they are assessing the needs. So far, people are arriving in a difficult shape, but the local authorities and the civil society in some of these countries is able to cope with the most critical needs. But as the war continues, we foresee that with an increasing number of refugees arriving, there might be some overwhelming situations in some of these countries. So we are monitoring very closely what happens in the borders. And at the same time, we are talking about a very large country. So we have the teams also trying to do cross-border assessments into Ukraine and to check what will happen with the internally displaced population, because we are talking about 2 million people who have left the country, but there are many other millions who are within the country, and the ones that have left the country are usually the ones who have the means, but the ones that are within the country still probably will have it more difficult to continue their journey somewhere else.
Okay, this is something that MSF does, but then just going back to the story that we saw before we went for the break, that they're saying they have nothing. You know, this is someone who has literally been forced out of their homes, out of their country, out of their jobs. How do you handle that situation? Where does someone start from there, even when in a neighboring country?
Yeah, well, you know, here in East Africa, we are very used to that. No?
Yeah.
I mean, many countries neighboring Kenya are experiencing long-term conflicts, wars. Ethiopia, South Sudan, Sudan. In East Africa, there are millions of refugees, internally displaced people who have lost everything. No? The focus is now on Ukraine. It's a devastating war. We must not forget that we are each year raising the numbers of people having to forcefully leave their homes. And of course, it's a very difficult situation for all these people. Difficult? No, it's extremely painful. People are being separated from their families, their husbands, their wives, the children, losing everything and not knowing this uncertainty, not knowing when they are going to be able to return home and how this home will look like in the future. No?
Yeah.
So, of course, the material loss is something, but probably the loss of relatives, the loss of friends, the loss of a country or a home is much more important even. No?
So do you think there's an end in sight, Brian?
Yeah, first of all, actually it will be very unfair if I do not give maybe a background of why these people are fighting and why Russia actually decided to invade Ukraine. As a matter of principle, of course, this should be the genesis of our discussion because Russia has not been comfortable with the Ukraine's quest to join NATO. And what is the problem with joining NATO with the Ukraine? That's one of the questions that perhaps begs. And I want to tell you that being a member of NATO, of course, and Article 5 of the NATO treaty, read together with the Washington Treaty and Article 5, of course, it gives these countries, member states, the ability to defend themselves collectively and also to defend or to fight together in the event one of the member states of NATO is attacked. So the principle actually is attack on us is an attack to all of us. And therefore, that's why Russia has not been comfortable with the Ukraine joining NATO, because that will insulate Ukraine in the sense that it will not be touched.
Okay.
In the sense that once you touch Ukraine, you touch the United States of America, you touch Canada, you touch all the allied member states, 30 plus of the NATO. And therefore, this is something that perhaps has brushed Russia in the wrong way, and therefore it has been fighting to ensure that Ukraine is demilitarized in the sense that it's crippled in military ways. And therefore, that's one of the genesis of why these people are fighting in its quest to ensure that it is not surrounded by strong opponents within that kind of sphere. Okay. Secondly, it is important for us to also understand that Russia, being a superpower on its own, let me put it that way, in terms of military, in terms of air skills and so on, has been rattling most of the states in the wrong way. And of course, once, in the advent of post-war conflict or the fall of the Iron Curtain in 1991, of course, we have seen Russia trying to ensure that most of the countries which were part of the USSR are not actually encroaching or are not being admitted to the NATO, because that will ensure that we'll see Russia being surrounded by strong allies, and that will actually make it feel uncomfortable. So that's one of the reasons why the war has actually started.
Just to add on that, if we're being honest, yes, Ukraine has been pushing to join NATO, but still they're not part of it. And let's not forget that on Friday last week, foreign ministers from NATO did say that they rejected any possibility of intervening against Russian forces. So then, since there has been negotiations happening, why not come to a peace deal?
I think the problem is that NATO has also been a friendly, as NATO had a sort of agreement with Russia that do not admit these member states which are surrounding me, especially the Eastern European countries, do not admit them, because these are some of the fears that Russia has in itself, that the moment you give these people that kind of insulation by admission to NATO, you will be by and large exposing Russia because of that kind of externalities in terms of aggression. And that has been one of the bone of contention. Of course, that has been agreed in principle in 1990s, and that was agreed upon, that NATO is not going to breach this kind of agreement. So I think, to me, NATO, that's why the reason why they are hesitant in terms of admitting countries such as Ukraine, because it will be actually living against that kind of agreement they had done before the fall of the Warsaw Pact and also the fall of the Iron Curtain in 1991, and that has to be respected within the realm of the understanding of Russia where it stands. Okay,
Igor, coming back to you, I think a few hours ago, about two or so, Ukraine said that Russia has agreed to a ceasefire on humanitarian corridors from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. What are the pros and cons of this?
Well, as we were saying before, these are options that normally appear in a frame of the war. No? These corridors, are, as a last resort, could be an option. They are, however, always a bit tricky because they are very time bound, and mostly or probably not everyone will be able to leave the conflict area. No? What is very important to underline here is that independently of how many people make it to another destination, to a safer destination using this time-bound corridor, the others that are left behind, as a civilians, they should have protection independently if the war continues, if the ceasefire ends. No?
Yeah.
So this is the far most important thing. We see how these options are constantly put on the table, but sometimes they are suspended, they are postponed, so they are always very, very tricky. But the most important thing is that the protection of civilians is ensured, and we are seeing already strong signs in this war, in this only 2 weeks, of a lot of disrespect towards civilians in infrastructures, structures, and even to the health system.
All right, it's a really good place to end it, gentlemen, because of time. But thank you very much for your company. Igor Garcia, who is the communications advisor of the MSF Emergency Unit.